Game design is a concept that is valued more than ever before in the light of the gaming industry having so many games to comb through. Terms like pacing, immersion, amazing visuals, and others are thrown around to elevate the value of a game's design. More often than not, critics give the most praise to a game with a grounded story and astounding graphics. But when you look back on the games that we've played over the years, the main thing that keeps bringing us back is actually a game's core design, with all of its replay value, fun mechanics, and memorable moments that we look back upon fondly. It's hard to say what makes the perfect game design blueprint, but one series that keeps topping itself with its evolution of gameplay and world building is Yakuza. From its ambitious beginnings on the PlayStation 2 to global acknowledgement during the PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5 eras, many things have changed for the team that created these games, but the core of the series has remained consistently solid throughout. From a compelling and grounded narrative to gameplay that's fun to watch and play yourself, we're looking at a product that is still evolving, despite many other series from its time being forced into being rebooted or being perpetually remade to carry on a brand's relevancy. So, what is it that makes the Yakuza series design so special? Since this is a topic that would make for a several hour-long video if tackled by a professional, and I'm no such thing, this video will cover 3 points that have caught my eye over the years. Let's start off with something that is a common point of criticism. Asset reuse is a practice that has gained a bit of notoriety in the industry, as it is frequently seen as a way to repackage the same game time and time again. This led many people with a passing familiarity of the Yakuza series to question why the fanbase would praise a reuse of maps, heat actions, and enemy movesets between certain entries. It's even become a meme within the community, but the way in which the Yakuza series reuses some of its assets, compared to its contemporaries, is actually one of its greatest qualities. Kamurocho is a map that has structurally remained fairly unchanged ever since its introduction in 2005. It's been present in a total of 15 out of the 18 Yakuza console games that were released thus far. So how do you keep the same map feeling fresh every single time? RGG Studios opted to give every single building in the city its own purpose. Many open-world games create a map that takes an exorbitant amount of time to traverse, while rarely having much to do in it outside of the main story, aside from finding a few collectibles or doing random questlines. Much of the space between these things feels wasted. Meanwhile, in Yakuza, Kamurocho isn't a fairly large map, but it is so densely packed that it feels like a condensed version of a proper open world. It retains all of the content that you would find there, but without the lengthy traversal between points of interest. I mentioned how every building here has a purpose, because a set of pixels that may have seemed insignificant back in Yakuza 1 can actually wind up being the centerpiece of the plots for a game like Kurohyou 1 and 2. Beyond the fact that there are also many shops with vastly different items for purchase scattered around the map, any building you might not be able to enter in one game has plot reasons as to its current state from another. Whether it be something like Shangri-La, which was collapsed during the events of Yakuza 1, the empty lot in Yakuza 0, which is now home to the Millennium Tower, or perhaps the old entrances to Purgatory. We've had the chance to see this city grow and change for so long, to the point where every pixel we see has a genuine story behind it. And not just a story that is implied, but one that we ourselves have experienced firsthand. Beyond that, you can even make a distinction between each and every version of Kamurocho. From Yakuza 3 being the first version of the map shown in full 3D, to the added sewer and rooftop system in Yakuza 4, to the countless friends that walk the streets in Judgment, every single game that features this city shows us a moment of its own lifespan, caught in time like a capsule. Treasure it while you can, because that restaurant you love to visit, or that one friend you greet on the street every now and then, might not be there when you return to the city in a few years. Immersion is another buzzword that gets thrown around casually. More often than not, it dictates whether or not the world you're experiencing feels believable to you as a player. Do you truly feel like a part of the story that unfolds, or are you constantly reminded of the fact that this is just a game? A way for games to be more believable was to give you control of a protagonist that isn't all-powerful. They tend to get tired, stumble when they're shot, and partake in stories that take themselves very seriously, as if to reaffirm video games as an art form in the eyes of outsiders. But in turn, when you strive for genuine realism, you run the risk of making a game that feels boring. One thing that a game like Shenmue 3 was criticized for was the fact that it emulated the tedium of the day-to-day life too closely at times. From slowly opening drawers, to always being strapped for cash, and having to greet your neighbor whenever you left the house. This does make for a realistic feeling world, but whether we want to admit it or not, games are still used as a form of escapism. A way to unwind and shake off the cobwebs from your boring day-to-day jobs and circumstances. Ultimately, you want the game to feel exciting and fun. Well, the Yakuza series has always prided itself on having an immersive and deep narrative, while still having some of the most fun gameplay segments you could find to date. Everyone remembers breakdancing as Majima during the anime encounters in Yakuza 0, and the funny thing is that this quote-unquote wacky gameplay didn't detract from the serious tone of the main story. The actions the protagonists take aren't out of character, and you're allowed to relish in the rush of a fight just as the characters who are full of life in front of you. Your pace isn't constantly cut up by unskippable cutscenes or slow walking segments. While such elements have their place, sometimes you just want to have fun with the game's mechanics, and with the implementation of the Dragon Engine, you can truly play at your own pace. If you want, you can skip the entire story, which ups the replayability factor significantly when you're playing through the game back to back. Furthermore, another aspect of game design that can disgruntle a player is the dreaded product placement. Some games are just very direct about that one company that they made a contract with, and it frequently breaks the intended immersion because of that. Meanwhile, Yakuza has an ungodly amount of product placement, and the reason why that is, once again, something that works in its favor, is that they didn't just stick to one brand. They have purchased licenses to use so many brands to where you stop thinking about the item you buy as a symbol of a supposed business partnership. For one thing, many of the brands shown aren't even present in the West, and because of the sheer amount of products that there are, you don't feel like you're being sold something, but more like you're walking through a gigantic shopping center as a tourist with unlimited funds. The choice is yours whether or not you want to partake in the experience presented by those products. All of this makes for the perfect simulation of a prominent red light district in the case of Kamurocho, while being an admirable showcase of virtual tourism when talking about all of the other cities in the Yakuza series. For this particular chapter to make sense, a tangent will be necessary. Like I've stated before, critics today show the most praise to projects with a strong emphasis on the narrative aspects of the world that they've built. It has reached a point to where these same critics will even overlook lackluster gameplay from a given release in lieu of its touching story. At least as far as the mainstream goes, the narrative tends to carry more weight and value than the gameplay, assuming it's structured like your average Emmy-winning television series. But the way I personally see it, the value of a game's narrative is only seen when you try to remove it from that game. If the story in question could easily be told through a different type of media, like for example a movie or a book, all the while feeling like not much of value was lost, then what was the point of telling this specific story through a video game? As odd as it may sound, a great video game story and a great story from a general standpoint aren't necessarily synonyms. Because of the trappings of the medium you choose, certain elements of a narrative are inevitably removed to prevent the overall pace from dragging on. The amount of detail that is shown in a book story is seldom mirrored in its adjacent live-action adaptation. In the same way, it takes a lot of effort from an incredibly cinematic narrative to feel like an inseparable part of the gameplay segments in your game of choice. In the case of something like The Last of Us, making a separate television series can result in the core sentiment of the experience remaining much the same, because the gameplay it was tied to rarely took creative liberties that couldn't be translated outside of the medium of video games. To give you an example, Metal Gear Solid had so many points where it broke the fourth wall to mess with the player's expectations, that moments like the game malfunctioning in Metal Gear Solid 2 or Psycho Mantis raiding your memory card in Metal Gear Solid 1 are as iconic, if not even more iconic, than the narrative of the Metal Gear games. That series would lose most of its value if either of these two design elements were missing in some way. To finally tie this back to the Yakuza series, the frequently cited tonal dissonance between the main story and the sub-stories feels like a natural occurrence considering the setting. The culture of Japan has given birth to some of the most uniform business practices and examples of societal structure, while at the same time leading to the creation of the most abstract art imaginable. It makes sense that both of these extremes would be present in this series, where its cultural heritage is at the true core of its lifespan. Yakuza wouldn't be what it is without its badass fights over opposing ideologies, or alternatively without half-naked perverts and dominatrixes trying to advance in their jobs. Each narrative spec in the series is as important to its design as the next. And the same thing goes for the combat, which can turn from choreographed elegance to manic bouts of chaos. The point is that this series could only truly exist in video game form, and it is so sincere about the disparate tones that can be achieved with this medium that this sincerity is one of, if not the greatest strength of the Yakuza series as an art form. People looking at the series from the outside might think we're overhyping it, and similarly, those of us who have been around for quite some time might have become desensitized to its many qualities. But upon returning to the franchise for some time, nothing feels quite like a Yakuza game. With every new release, it feels like the developers are letting you go behind the scenes with them and follow every step of the way as they try to create the best Yakuza game they ever could. Each game we see is a step in that evolution, to the point where it feels like we've all been a part of this project that's been growing since 2005. The fans of Yakuza, or Like a Dragon, are as much of a part of its identity as the people of RGG Studios themselves, and that is something worthy of the highest praise. With that, I would like to conclude this topic. If you'd like to add on to this discussion, feel free to share your own thoughts in the comments. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'll try to figure out how to afford all of the new releases that await us this year. Until next time, take care of yourselves and have a great day. Cheers!